Welcome to the Supply Chain Pioneers podcast, where we highlight industry leaders on the forefront of innovation and technology in planning, procurement, and logistics. Hosted by your supply chain pro to know, Ulf Venn.
Jon Davis, Chief Meteorologist for Everstream, and that's been my role for much of my career. I would sit on the farm and watch weather as a little kid, and I was fascinated about it. Yeah, I got the job in New York. I had never been to New York City before. I was kid in the Midwest that barely even knew what Wall Street was. I'll be totally honest with you. There's never been a season going into it that's had the kind of risk that we have going into this season in the Atlantic Basin.
Supply Chain Pioneers is powered by Everstream Analytics. Everstream gives you the predictive insights and analytics to make your supply chain faster, smarter, safer, and leaner. Go to everstream.ai to book your demo today. Hello, everybody, and welcome to a new episode of Supply Chain Pioneers. And with me today, I have Jon Davis, who's the Chief Meteorologist at Everstream Analytics. Welcome, Jon.
Hey, Elf.
So, Jon, as it is normal for this podcast, let's have a short and quick introduction from your side before we deep dive on everything that is Jon Davis.
Sure. So Jon Davis, Chief Meteorologist for Everstream, and that's been my role for kind of much of my career as to applied meteorology, applying weather and climate to things. So we can get into all the different entities out there, but I've been applied meteorologist the time I graduated university, which is a long time ago, to today.
Yeah. And something you have maybe not mentioned, but I just mentioned it for you, is you are essentially a rock star in the meteorologist world, right? So if you go on stage, people do listen to you quite a lot, right? You're a sought after keynote speaker when it comes to the topic of climate, weather, and supply chain risk, actually. So very happy to have you today. And we want to start a little bit at the start, which is, how did your fascination for weather actually start?
It started very young. So I grew up in the Chicago area, in the Midwest of the US, but my parents were both farm kids who both became high school English teachers. So in the summers, we would go back to the farm. It was in South Dakota. And I would sit on the farm and watch weather as a little kid. And I was fascinated about it. I would sit on my uncle's tractor and watch the great weather in South Dakota. And that's when I was like 5 and 6 and 7 years old. So from the time I was a little kid, I always said, I want to be a meteorologist. And that was really something that from about the time I could walk, that's what I wanted to do. And so in school, young school, every report that I would do was always weather-based. I had a weather kind of a unit in my backyard where I would like monitor weather conditions in the backyard. And so I was always into it. So really what happened, my hobby as a little kid then became a profession. And it's still kind of my hobby today. So it's been a very natural path.
Yeah. And so the natural progression was you studying weather in university, and actually was a university in Wisconsin. And then you directly went into commodity research, which I would call the first step into the supply chain world.
Yeah.
So how did you end up at Wall Street and working for Citigroup in commodity research?
Yeah, so right after I graduated from Madison, Wisconsin, one of the premier meteorology schools in the world at that time, and still nowadays too, I got a job with Citigroup on Wall Street. So what they wanted is they wanted an agricultural meteorologist to look at weather and how it affects crops around the world. I had the agricultural background because my parents were farm kids, spent all of my summers on the family farms back in South Dakota. So I knew crops, I knew livestock, I knew farming very well. So I had the agricultural background, but then I also had the meteorological background through the university. So yeah, I got the job in New York. I had never been to New York City before. I was kid in the Midwest that barely even knew what Wall Street was. I'll be totally honest with you. It was not my world, my family world. So I'm 23 years old. I said, what the heck? Yeah, let's go. And I went to New York, never been there before. And then that was the beginning of 18 years, working with Citigroup.
Amazing. So you have now worked with commodities for a long, long time. And obviously, you have a profound passion for it, as I can see whenever we talk about the new commodity and how the way you deep dive and research on it. So, what makes commodity trading so special for you? And what is it that you have maybe picked up over the years as tips and tricks that you would have loved to tell yourself when you started working in this field?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, what I loved about it is the applied nature of it. Not just doing weather, but applying that to things. So, there's a little bit of agronomy in it. There's obviously a lot of weather. There's a lot of data that's involved in that, in trying to look at the situation and assess overall, is this beneficial for crops, whether that's in India or Australia or Europe or the US, or is it detrimental to crops here overall? So I enjoyed the integration of all these factors coming together. And then forecasting was the big thing. Forecasting, potential issues or improvement in crops overall, looking at areas of the world where problems were developing, taking climatic principles, meaning like things like El Nino and La Nina, or tropical convection, and using that to make forecast ahead as to what areas potentially will have problems. So really, it was the integration of all of those things together that I found absolutely fascinating. And very quickly, when I went to Wall Street in New York, I realized that I really like doing this a lot. In fact, I remember my first couple of months, I'd get paychecks, and so I would say to myself, I'm sitting here, I'm watching weather, I'm talking to people about weather, and they're paying me for this. I go, this is incredible. That wore off after a little bit of time, of course, but that was kind of my thing going in, it's what I'd always done in my life, and now it was my job. So.
Yeah, no, I can imagine that. Me getting paid for talking about supply chains is a similar vein, right? I love this. Okay, moving on to really make sure everybody understands the depth of your knowledge on applied meteorology. At Chesapeake Energy, which was your next stop in your journey, you actually picked up the weather impacts on energy as a new field and new topic of focus. So, what were similarities applying weather to energy instead of commodities, and what were similarities?
Yeah. So, I mean, Chesapeake was a little bit different. And again, I never thought I would leave Citigroup, but then the guy that started Chesapeake, a real famous guy called Aubrey McClendon, I sent an email one day and said, would you and the team like to come over to Chesapeake? We're a rapidly growing energy company, and they became this huge company overall. So they were a production company of natural gas. And during the 10 or 11 years there, they kind of changed the world of natural gas. And so instead of doing trading and giving information that would help individuals trade, this was more hedging. So protecting your overall commodities and hedging. At the same time, we were always doing agricultural work overall, and a lot of the clients at Citigroup, we bought over to Chesapeake, and we had a little agricultural unit, on the side, but the energy information always stayed with Chesapeake. In some ways, the energy part of it was actually a little bit clearer and a little bit easier than agriculture, because it's really just temperatures. It's temperatures and how that relates to heating demand in the winter and cooling demand in the summer, and some supply issues like in the Gulf of Mexico if you get a tropical system here coming through. So it was a little bit different in that sense here overall. Very data driven. Agricultural is data driven too, but energy much more so overall. And it was really, looking out and then trying to predict what energy demand would be doing here during that time frame. So another kind of fascinating avenue in looking at overall applied meteorology in the global energy sector.
Yeah. No, it's super interesting actually. I think it's a maybe a still underused way of looking at energy, right? I think worldwide, I believe, especially now with climate change. I think a lot of more companies need to pick that up.
Yeah, no question. Yeah, no question.
Good. So then you were still at Chesapeake, but started with a new weather hobby, I would call it at first, which was you were a research partner for EarthRisk,
Right.
which then started to be coming out of university, starting to be a startup venture. You were still following it. Eventually, you joined EarthRisk, which then a few transitions afterwards became part of Everstream Analytics. So, how was that transition for you? All of a sudden, being from these very big companies into a small startup, and then seeing the transformation and the way you continuously had to reinvent applying weather to different things within the supply chain.
Right. So it was interesting is that while at Chesapeake, we were part of this kind of symposium in getting groups together in the private sector, as well as universities. There's actually Scripps out in San Diego in the United States. And so it was a consortium in doing this kind of cutting edge research, looking at forecast information over long periods of time overall. So we were already involved in that for many, many years at Chesapeake. And then actually the entire team then went over to that side and we began doing agricultural energy work within the framework of overall Earth risk. A much smaller firm, Citigroup, when I left, was the biggest firm on the planet. Chesapeake became a very big firm in the 10 years. I think when I started at Chesapeake, there were 400 employees. It quickly became 13,000 employees within like 3 or 4 years. Crazy growth. And this was a smaller company. And it's interesting there are pros and cons with any of those situations like that. But the things that you do at a smaller entity like that certainly have major impacts. And when you decide something, it's decided in an hour or in a day. Whereas in bigger firms, it takes long. There's more bureaucracy. There's good things about the bigger firms too. So it's really kind of a pro and con situation. But really doing the same things, applied meteorology, ag and energy, within those sectors here. So and some of the same clients that we had at Citigroup, back from the 80s, we then keep on, overall having in our client base here at EarthRisk and still today at Everstream. So some of the clients I've worked with literally for almost 40 years. So
yeah, it's so funny. But it just shows the expertise. Anyway, so now at EarthRisk, later RiskPulse, now Everstream, you have been deeply involved in a lot of different aspects of the supply chain, especially including logistics.
Yep.
Where weather has a profound impact on logistics.
Mm-hmm.
So, how did your overall perception change over the years on supply chain and its complexity? And especially when you started commodity trading, right? You still thought about things have to be shipped from A to B, but probably not that the complexity behind it. And how is it then and now, essentially?
Yeah. So before we get to that, maybe just a quick subset as to how the whole supply chain thing happened, right?
Mm-hmm.
It fell in our lap. It was not something that was very designed, as lots of things kind of do. So during the winter in the States, the winter of 13 and 14, an extremely cold winter, and for much of the country. And after that winter, a couple of very big beer companies, they're still clients actually today, actually reached out and said, we lost millions of dollars of beer. And that beer froze, it froze in kegs, it froze in bottles, it froze in cans. It was millions of dollars of beer. And coming from the very top of these very big firms, they said, this can never happen again. Can you help us? And we said, of course we can help. And we started to get into, beer that was being, shipped, whether it's by rail or by truck, and protecting that from a supply chain standpoint. So that really began getting into the supply chain. And then that just grew and grew overall. And again, the difference between that is that the trading world is a very small piece of the pie of like global commerce. The supply chain world is massive. It just opened up so many new opportunities in so many areas that people needed help overall. And what was really interesting coming from the financial world, both at Chesapeake and also from Citigroup, coming from that world and going into supply chain logistics, the big difference was, rate of, development, if you will. So I always considered that trading was always 10 or 15 years ahead of kind of things like in the supply chain. They did things, kind of the old way. We'd always done things this way. We always used to. And so we began to take some of the ideas that came out of trading and integrate that into, risk from a supply chain standpoint. But there was a very big gap there. I think that gap has become a bit smaller over time, but there was a very big gap there. The trading world was always kind of the cutting edge, where scientific aspects would come out very rapidly. And then those ideas then were kind of taken into the supply chain world and then used in that world as well. Protection of product, overall logistics, and then, getting into things like, demand planning and, crops and whatever that is here, kind of out there. And of course, ag and energy is a very important part of that in the end-to-end supply chain. So that the pathway was very structured, although it's one of those things that just kind of happened, not really planned over time.
Yeah, but I think that's if you look at the podcast, we have done this a lot, and we see that there always, in hindsight, seems to be a natural transition, whereas it just happened in between, right? You just fell into it somehow.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I think you're actually right with the observation that supply chain might be a little bit behind overall trading technologies, because in the end, supply chain is a rather young function, I would say.
Yeah.
Right? It has, before logistics was just shipping out stuff, and then all of a sudden this developed. But in comparison, I think it's still rather young, and there's a lot to do, which is great. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Good. So now we have talked about your experience, where you're coming from, already hyped you up at the very beginning, being the expert that you are, which I stand behind, and that's true. But let's talk about today and the intelligence you bring to the market right now, because we are in the start of hurricane season, right? It's always very exciting for supply chains because there are a lot of risks coming up with that. So how do you think hurricane season will shape up this year? And also, what are some of the tips and tricks you learned over the years talking to supply chain people that you might want to share with the audience?
Yeah. So the big risk out there in the northern hemisphere, tropical season, the West Pac, of course, China, the Koreas, Japan, the Atlantic Basin, the big risk is in the Atlantic Basin. And the risk going into the season, which again, the peak of the season is August, September, and early October. We're a long ways away from that now. But the preseason risk going into this season in the Atlantic Basin is the highest I've ever seen by a very formidable margin overall. Um, I've been doing this for 40 years almost. Next year will be my 40th year. I have never seen the kind of risk going into the season in the Atlantic Basin that we have this year. There's two main entities or two main variables that are driving, that assessment. Number one, the transition to La Nina, and by the time we get to midsummer and fall, we'll be in a La Nina event. That is an enhancer of activity in the Atlantic Basin, the Gulf of Mexico, the Caribbean, the tropical Atlantic. The second item is that water temperatures in the Atlantic basin are at record highs. We've never seen water temperatures at these levels, and they're expected to stay at these record levels through the season overall. So you have this unique combination of a La Nina event, an enhancer of overall activity, and record warm water temperatures, fuel, if you will, for systems in the Atlantic basin. The bottom line is that there's never been a season going into it that's had the kind of risk that we have going into this season in the Atlantic basin, no question. So that's what we're informing our clients of. That's what we're talking about kind of out there. And, from a standpoint of, how do you can't get into specifics right now. Will Miami get hit? Will Puerto Rico get hit? Will Houston get hit with a major system here overall? But we know that the risk is higher in all of those locations. So planning ahead, having contingency plans, using real strategy out there, and being prepared in all of those areas, whether it's, coastal areas for port operations, facilities, whether it's transportation across those regions for people, that are working in those areas for, energy operations in the Gulf of Mexico. All of those have to be dealt with at a very heightened risk, and anything that can be done to prepare ahead of the season, whatever those preparations are, generators, water, some of the basic things kind of out there, this is a really good year to do that.
Also consider communication strategy, right? Because it involves so many different departments, from procurement to security to HR to maybe IT security, because you have to do backups. There are so many different things you have to consider. Having that laid out in ahead of time definitely makes a lot of sense in a situation like that. Yeah, simulate it essentially.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. But there's no reason to scare people, but you don't want to candy coat it either. The data is the data, right? And so you put that out there, and anything that can be done ahead of time, you do, but you have to be aware of the risk, and that information is very important. And so to get prepared for this season, which again looks very, very active.
Yeah. Okay. Let's go to the next big topic that is going on right now in the weather world, and I think that will stay for quite a while, which is first of all, it's climate change, but I want to start with actually where you live. You live in Barcelona, which has probably seen profound impacts of climate change in the last couple of months. And it's affecting people on a daily basis there. So how do you felt about the situation yourself, especially being from the field of meteorology and having seen that coming? And then also, what are other maybe short to midterm impacts in the next 5 to 10 years that companies should be aware of?
Well, for someone that observes the weather, and literally I look at it every day, I've done that most of my life overall, it was very apparent 20, 25, 30 years ago that something was different and something is changing. And some of those changes have accelerated, with time, whether it's when I was living in Chicago or whether I was living here in Barcelona. You can see things happening out there that make it very obvious and evident that climate change has been happening, and no longer is it a forecast, but it's happening in the real time and affecting areas around the globe. In general, the tropics tend to be affected more than other areas in general, but most areas are affected, in some way. So one of the things that we've studied a lot, and one of the things that I'm really interested in, is extreme weather events out there in the supply chain, the disruptors in the supply chain, whether that's extreme weather events and incidents of heat and how that affects crops or workers or facilities or cargo airports out there. You have the heat aspect and drought aspect overall. Some of the terms that have been used to describe that part of it the last 5 or 8 years is heatflation, if you will. There's a whole nother part of it on the wet side of things, more flooding. We've seen that lately in Rio Grande do Sul in Brazil, what happened in Dubai 2 months ago, the flooding events kind of out there overall. And long-term higher humidity levels. We've done some work on looking at the increase in humidity on a global basis. Almost all areas of the world have increased atmospheric moisture or humidity. So the term that's kind of used for that I find fascinating is called sogflation. Sogflation, the impacts of wet conditions on things, applying that meteorologically. And it's really interesting. The more clients we talk to about this issue, the more things they keep bringing up. Degradation of agricultural products, quality of foods, for example, and they tend to last, in a much shorter duration than they used to here overall. But that whole incident, the nuance of the details in looking at the wet end of things. I think a lot of people talk about the heat and the dryness, but that wet end of things and the impacts on supply chains overall, ramifications all over the world here, especially quality of products, transportation of products, and that whole issue, which the new term now on that is sogflation. That's a term that's been really interesting, and doing the data analysis behind that has been pretty fascinating overall. And it's really interesting. Everyone we talk to about this, something clicks and they say, oh, we've noticed this. We've noticed that some of our shipments here, we tend to have more mold and mildew than we used to. We tend to have more issues here from a standpoint of higher humidity levels, higher dew points, workers too, or cities, like Hong Kong, just being much more humid than they used to overall. So that part of it, the details of it, I find terribly fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely sounds very fascinating for sure. So we are, unfortunately, because this has been great, coming to the end of the podcast, and we always close with a hobby question. So I do know, because we have talked in the past, that paddle is your new passion. And therefore, I had to ask, what does paddle, applied meteorology, and supply chains have in common? Yeah, that's it, actually.
Yeah, great question. What do they have in common? I played racquetball in the States for like 35 years. I came to Barcelona, I switched to paddle. It's an easy transition overall. Uh, well, one thing with paddle or with supply chains, there's no substitute for hard work, right? Whether you're on the paddle court or training or working out as part of that, or working at things here in the supply chain, no substitute for hard work. And then the strategy, right? Knowing the game, if you will, the strategy of that, and, how to take an issue, right? How to win a point, how to make a better situation in the supply chain, having that strategy, to the end goal. I guess in this case, is kind of to win, right? It's to win in paddle and to mitigate risk in the supply chain world here overall. So yeah, hard work is always something, but then the strategy of it all, the strategy of the game, if we want to call supply chain a game, the strategy of that in doing that within that. So yeah, there certainly are some similarities between paddle and in the supply chain world for sure.
Yeah. Actually, we have a lot of US listeners. I'm not sure. I think paddle is not so much a thing there, but it's more pickleball, I believe, which is kind of similar. Similar but different, right? I mean, similar but different, right?
It's something but different, yeah.
In Europe, paddle has more developed, and in the US, as pickleball has more developed. So essentially, it's you use a smaller racket, and you kind of like squash can also use the walls, right? On a smaller field like you have in pickleball as well. So it's tennis-ish sports, I would call it. I don't know.
Exactly. The big difference is back wall. So which racquetball has back wall, paddle has back wall and side wall. So the big thing is walls. So changes the game totally. Yeah.
Yeah. Makes it very interesting.
Yeah.
Good. Jon, this has been a blast. and it has gone by so quickly. We're already at the end. I could talk for a lot longer, but yeah, let's keep it at that for now. And maybe you come back for some news coverage on important weather events.
Great to be here. Super fun. I could do this for 3-4 hours. It was really fun.
Perfect. So thank you so much for being here, and everybody listening and watching. Thank you so much for your attention. And with that, we want to say bye-bye.
Thank you.
This was Supply Chain Pioneers. Thanks for watching, listening, or however you are enjoying this podcast. You can find Supply Chain Pioneers on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, all other major podcast players, as well as on YouTube at Ulf Talk Supply Chain. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment. See you next time.